said to me, Rusty, I think on Sunday, there were so many people gone last Sunday, I think you should preach that sermon again. And I thought about that, and I thought, I like that idea. Because golfing season, it's kind of coming to the end, and this is going to be might be my last chance to hit the course here. But I decided against it. But I do want to take a few minutes, because so many of you weren't here last week, and because it's so important to understand what's happening here. I want to take a couple of minutes to recap what we looked at last week, because this message isn't going to make any sense without that context. Last week, we began what will probably be a 2-month or so journey looking at Abraham's life. Abraham is probably the second most important human being in history. Do you know who number 1 is? Jesus. Good. That's the right answer. Number 2, I think, is probably Abraham. And I say that because, here where Abraham's life begins, after that you get 99% of the Bible, which is about 2,000 years of history. There's far more than 2,000 years of human history that takes place in the first 11 chapters, but not a lot of detail there. Something pivotal happens when Abraham's story becomes part of God's story for mankind. Something pivotal happens right here in Genesis chapter 12 that changes human history forever. And it's not because of who Abraham was. In those first 11 chapters, God seeks out a righteous man. He looks on the earth, he finds Noah. Noah's a righteous man. There's really none of them left anymore. I'm going to pick Noah. And Noah, I'm going to give you a command, and I'm going to put my eggs in the Noah basket. Noah, we're told, was a righteous man. We don't hear that about Abraham. In fact, we find out Abraham, he's just a run-of-the-mill, moon-worshipping idolater. There's nothing particularly special about Abraham at all in this story. He's important, not because of who he is. He's important because of what God is to him. Okay? Not because of what Abraham achieved, but what God will achieve through Abraham. Abraham wasn't different. God was different with Abraham. Abraham wasn't special. God did a special thing through Abraham. And this is important because what we're going to see here is a picture of the special thing that God is doing in us and wants to do in us. Up until this point in the story of human history, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, God blesses people, and then he gives them instructions how to stay in God's blessing. Adam and Eve, here's this garden. Here's how to stay in this good place. And what happens? They mess up. Seth, I'm going to bless you. Here's my blessing. Here's what I want you to do to stay in this blessing. Fails. Noah, here's my blessing. Okay, I've set you up, man. Live in this. Obey these commands. What happens? Him and the people that come from him mess up miserably. And what we find is that time and time again, mankind, even though they have they begin with the blessing of God, and God gives them his instructions to how to stay in that blessing, they end up failing miserably again and again. They end up turning from God's way to their way and become utterly corrupt and wicked. And so this is where Abraham enters the story. Mankind is dark. Abram, of that godly line, is now worshiping the moon gods. There's no more knowledge of God. No one following after God. Man has totally turned to their own way. And then God does something different. He calls Abraham with a call that he's never called anybody with before. It's a new call. Because it's a call that doesn't just come with a command, but it's a call that comes with an incredible promise. That makes this call totally unique at this point. This is that call. Genesis 12, 1-3. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." So he says, leave everything behind and follow me. I will guide you. And then God makes a promise to him. He says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So the call to Abraham is, come follow me. And here's the thing, you don't have to do it. I will bless you. I will make you a great nation. God says again, I will, I will, I will. All you have to do is leave where you are and follow after me, and I will show you where to go. And this is what makes God's call on Abram totally different. It's the call of grace. Because not only will God show him where to go, but he will actually be the one that makes sure he gets there. And so last week we talked about the power of God's call to Abraham. It wasn't that Abraham was qualified to receive God's call, but the call that God gave him qualified him. God would accomplish the call that he had given to Abram. It would be God's doing, not Abraham's. All Abraham would have to do is walk in faith. So whenever Paul in the New Testament wants to talk about what the Christian life looks like, he goes back and he doesn't talk about David, he doesn't really talk about Moses. He's always going back and talking about Abraham. You want to know what the Christian life is like? You know what? Want to know what God's call on us through Jesus is like? He says, look at the life of Abraham, because Abraham's story is our story. In fact, the word church, I don't use my Greek very often because I've forgotten 99% of it. But one thing I haven't forgotten is that the word in the New Testament church is the Greek word ecclesia, which is ek kalo. Ek being out, kalo being called. So literally the word church means to be called out. The called out ones. Right? Just as Abraham was called out, something different. So the church are those who have been called out of the world by God to something greater, to his call. And just as the call of God on Abraham was a call of grace, so it is for us, right? God calls us through Jesus and says, turn from your way, which is what repenting means. Repent of your sins, turn from your way, turn towards me, trust in Jesus, what he has done for you that you cannot do for yourself. Trust in him and his work, and follow me in faith. And I will do in you, I will accomplish in you everything that I call you to, if you walk in faith. So none of us are qualified to follow God. I mean, God didn't come to Harry Haddocken and call him because Harry was special. Right? We all know Harry's not special, right? Way to go, James. Stick up for your husband. See, none of us are special, right? God doesn't look down and go, oh, there's a special person who fits the bill. I'm going to give them my calling. No, none of us qualify for God's call. But when God chooses to call us, that call comes with the promise. I will accomplish my call in your life. So the call qualifies us. Our response then, just like Abraham, is to be walking in faith. And you'll notice that as he responded to God's call and left his land, left his family, God only showed him where to go in transit. Right? God didn't say, this is where I'm sending you, here's the GPS coordinates, here's a map. He said, I will show you where to go as you go. You're just going to have to trust in me every step of the way, that tomorrow, when you wake up, I'm going to show you which direction to go. And then the day after that, when you wake up again and go, where now, Lord? I'm going to show you what direction to go, and I will lead you to the land of promise and fulfill those promises. So Abram went, and God did bring him into the land of promise. The land we now know as Israel. Back then it was called Canaan. And we found in the verses prior to what we read that he enters the land of promise. And the first thing he does is he builds an altar to the Lord. And then we're told that Abraham calls on the name of the Lord, which is just a way of saying Abram worships God. So here he is, finally, he has entered that place of God's promise. Right? You think, here's a happy guy. He builds the altar, he worships God, and Abram lives happily ever after. Let's close in prayer. You laugh because you know that's not the end of Abram's story, is it? Things happen. It's not happily ever after for Abraham. Some things will happen that will threaten that promise. That will threaten the realization of God's blessing in his life that God had promised. And we're going to look at a few of those things that happen that seemingly threaten God's promise. Because God's promise, if God will make out of Abraham a great nation, it requires what? It's going to require one offspring, right? And we've already been told Sarah's barren. In other words, he's really not qualified for this call. God picks the guy with a barren wife just to show us, hey, buddy, this ain't going to be you. This is all on me. This ain't going to be you. Because you got a barren wife, this is going to have to be me. So, you're going to need offspring and you're going to need land. Right? To be a great nation, he needs those two things. He needs a land for his nation, and he needs offspring to create the nation. And it's interesting here because in these two little stories we're going to look at, and we're going to compare how Abraham responds to the threat, we see that those two things are threatened. The offspring and the land. So here we are in verse 10. So there he is. He's in the land of promise. Put up my feet, drink lemonade, let God do his thing. And then what happens in verse 10? Now there is a famine in the land. We find out it's a severe famine. I wonder if that kind of took Abraham by surprise. Here he is. He's reached the destination. He's going to live the good life, reap all the blessings of faith. And what happens? Boom! Famine. And this famine is going to threaten, or seemingly threaten from a human perspective, threaten the realization of God's promise, because in this famine, his very survival is at stake. And I wonder if by Abraham's response, he was surprised at this trial. That this came unexpected, that there would be a test or there would be a hurdle that he might have to cross in the realization of God's blessing in his life. Because, we all know this, right? If you're taken by surprise as you're walking, you stumble, don't you? Even over something small. But if you expect something, you stay upright. But if you don't expect something, all it takes is a curb to put you on your face. You've done this. Maybe walking up or down the stairs in the middle of the night when it started, and you thought there was one more stair, and there wasn't. What happened? You probably put a hole through your drywall with your forehead, right? Or maybe you thought there was one more stair or there was one less stair than there was, and you caught your foot and you tumbled because you didn't expect it. But if you expect it, if you're walking on a stony, rough path, but you're looking at the step in front of you, and you expect where you're going to put your feet, you have no problem. But you can be walking on a smooth, flat sidewalk and step off a curb accidentally and do a face plant. So how you react to a situation is kind of dependent on whether you expected it or not. And I wonder if Abram was taken aback that here he is following God in faith, and he suffers a famine that to his mind threatens God's promise. And he stumbles. And I think the first lesson for here is, guys, faith has its tests, doesn't it? Faith has its tests. There are hurdles as we walk in faith. Things that to our eyes seem to be obstacles to God's blessing in our life. I love to watch sports. There's some sports you watch because it's beautiful to watch the sport, right? Like soccer, they call it the beautiful game. You ever seen one of those amazing soccer goals and you're like, how do they do that with their feet? That's beautiful. I wish I could do that. And then there's other sports you don't watch because it's beautiful. You watch because of the possibility of disaster, right? Does anybody watch car racing other than with the hopes of seeing a wreck? That's the only reason I ever watch. And after a while, there hasn't been a crash. This is boring. Click, right? Or hurdles. Does anybody watch the 110-meter hurdles Other than the fact they want to see somebody do a face plant on asphalt. That's the only reason I've ever watched hurdles. And it's really disappointing when everybody gets over the hurdle. Because nobody watches hurdles to see that, right? We know that the Christian life is a race. Paul calls it a race. And if the Christian life is a race, it's a race of hurdles, right? There are these obstacles that stand between us and the reward. Us and the blessing. And Abram, I think, was taken by surprise at the trouble he was about to face, even though he was walking in God's will. And he stumbles. And we find this here, this little story of what happens in Egypt. Because Abraham goes into manage mode. Okay, there's a famine. Uh-oh, this isn't good. This could threaten my survival. It threatens the promise of God. What are you going to do, Abraham? What are you going to do? Okay, I could go to Egypt. I've heard through the grapevine they're doing okay in Egypt. There's no famine there. I could move the family to Egypt. And that's what he decides to do. Okay, we're going to go to Egypt. Okay, Sarah, we're going to Egypt. And en route he goes, oh my goodness, you're beautiful. They might kill me because you're beautiful, because they might want you. And so, what are we going to do? Okay, say you're my sister. Okay? Because then I'll survive. And after all, if I'm dead, God can't fulfill his promise, can he? I need to keep myself alive. So he concocts this plan. And it involves deception. Because he feels that the promise is threatened. There will be no offspring if he is dead. And so Abraham enacts his plan, and what happens? It doesn't go well, does it? Abraham, in his own wisdom, in his own working and striving, makes things worse for himself. Because all of a sudden, my wife is now in Pharaoh's harem. Okay. Now the promise is threatened because of what he does, right? How's he going to get his wife back? You're not going to go to Pharaoh's palace and demand your wife back. How are you going to get your wife back so that God can fulfill his promise and give you a child, and you can get back to that other country and fulfill God's promise? He just makes this big mess of it by taking everything into his own hands. God is gracious, isn't he? What does God do? He strickens Pharaoh with a plague. Our loving, gracious God gives Pharaoh and his household a plague to force Pharaoh to give the wife back. He saves Abram's skin from himself. God is good. God is gracious here. Remember, it's his doing. But what went wrong in this story? What's the whole point of this story? If you compare it to the verses that came before, where Abraham is called by God and obeys in faith and leaves his homeland and goes to the promised land, we see that was all God's initiative. It was God that was speaking. It was God that was leading. It was Abraham that was listening, and Abraham that was obeying. It was all God's initiative. But here, in this story where Abraham goes to Egypt, God is nowhere to be seen here, is he? I mean, you read the story, God doesn't speak. Abraham doesn't seek God. Abraham doesn't speak to God. Abraham seems to be on his own, with his own thought and his own plan. It's now Abraham's initiative. He will protect God's promise. And so Abraham takes control of the situation in order to protect the promise that God has given, in order to